The fog rolled off the Harlem River like the breath of a dying dragon, thick and gray, carrying with it the scent of salt, oil, and the deep, rotting decay of the water. It was 3 a.m, the hour of the wolf, when the city of New York slept its fitful, uneasy sleep. But beneath the silence, the streets were always awake, watching, waiting for the blood that greased the gears of the underworld. On this particular Tuesday in November, the silence under the 138th Street Bridge was shattered not by a gunshot, but by the frantic, terrified whistle of a night watchman who had stumbled upon a nightmare. Bumpy Johnson was awake. He was always awake at this hour. He sat in the study of his brownstone, a book of philosophy open on his lap, a glass of lukewarm water on the table beside him. Mamie was asleep upstairs, her breathing a soft rhythm that usually anchored him to the world of the living. But tonight, Bumpy felt a restlessness in his bones, a phantom itch that told him the wind was changing. He had survived decades in the life by listening to that itch. It was the instinct of a predator who knows, long before the scent hits the air, that a rival is circling. The phone rang. It was a harsh, mechanical scream in the quiet house. Bumpy picked it up before the second ring. He didn't say hello. He never did. "Talk," Bumpy said, his voice a low rumble of granite. "Bumpy!" The voice on the other end was breathless, tight with panic. It was Zip, his right hand, his shadow. Zip didn't panic. Zip was a man who could cut a throat while eating a sandwich. If Zip was panicked, the world had tilted off its axis. "You need to come down to the river, under the bridge. The cops are already there, but I told them to wait." "Who is it?" Bumpy asked, standing up, the book sliding to the floor, forgotten. "Just come, Bumpy," Zip whispered. "Please, just come." Bumpy hung up. He didn't wake Mamie. He moved with the silent efficiency of a ghost, pulling on his trousers, his shirt, his heavy wool coat. He checked his snub-nosed .38, slid it into the holster at his hip, and walked out into the cold mist. His driver was already waiting, the engine of the Cadillac idling, the exhaust pluming white in the darkness. They drove in silence. Bumpy stared out the window at the passing streetlights, watching the shadows stretch and retreat. He counted the blocks. He prepared his face. He locked away the husband, the philosopher, the chess player. He let the face of the king settle over his features, a mask of stone that showed no fear, no pity, and no weakness. When they reached the bridge, the scene was a tableau of chaos, illuminated by the spinning red cherry tops of 3 police cruisers. A crowd had started to gather, held back by a line of uniformed officers. They were whispering, pointing, their faces twisted in a mixture of horror and morbid curiosity. Bumpy stepped out of the car. The crowd parted. They didn't part because of the police. They parted because Bumpy Johnson was walking. He moved through them like a shark through a school of minnows. A police captain, a man Bumpy paid $500 a month to look the other way, stepped forward, his face pale and sweating despite the chill. "Mr. Johnson," the captain said, holding up a hand, "you don't want to see this. Let us handle it. We'll get the coroner wagon down here, clean it up." "Move," Bumpy said. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He just spoke a single word that carried the weight of a death sentence. The captain swallowed hard and stepped aside. "I'm sorry, Bumpy. We found him 20 minutes ago." Bumpy walked past the police line. He walked into the shadows under the steel girders of the bridge. Zip was standing there, his hat in his hand, looking at the ground. Zip looked up, and Bumpy saw tears in the hard man's eyes. Bumpy looked up. The body was hanging from a low beam, swaying slightly in the river breeze. The rope was thick, rough hemp. The hands were tied behind the back. The face was a ruin. It had been beaten, bruised, swollen beyond recognition. But Bumpy knew the clothes. He knew the shoes. He knew the way the boy's shoulders slumped. It was Elias. Elias was 22 years old. He wasn't a gangster. He wasn't a runner. He was a student at City College. He wore glasses. He liked to talk about history and civil rights. He was Mamie's favorite nephew, a boy Bumpy had taken under his wing, paying for his books, his tuition, keeping him strictly away from the business. Elias was the promise of what the Johnson family could be if they washed the blood off their hands. He was the future, and now he was meat hanging from a bridge. Bumpy didn't scream. He didn't fall to his knees. The air left his lungs in a slow, ragged hiss, but his face didn't crack. He walked closer. He reached out and touched the boy's shoe. It was cold. Pinned to Elias's chest with a jagged knife was a piece of cardboard. On it, scrawled in crude black charcoal, were the words, "King of the Apes." It wasn't just a murder. It was a lynching. It was a hate crime. It was a message sent by men who didn't just want to kill Bumpy's family. They wanted to humiliate them. They wanted to remind Bumpy that no matter how much money he had, no matter how many suits he wore, to them, he was just an animal. "Cut him down," Bumpy whispered. "The coroner needs to," the captain started. "I said cut him down," Bumpy roared, the sound echoing off the concrete pillars like a thunderclap. It was a sound so full of raw, primal violence that the police officers flinched, their hands drifting nervously to their batons. Zip pulled out a switchblade. He climbed onto a crate and sawed through the rope. Bumpy caught the body as it fell. He caught the dead weight of the boy he had promised to protect. He held him for a moment, ignoring the blood that soaked into his cashmere coat. He laid Elias gently on the dirty concrete. He pulled the knife out of the chest and crumbled the cardboard sign in his fist until his knuckles turned white. "Who?" Bumpy asked, staring down at the boy's battered face. "We don't know yet," the captain said nervously. "But word is, a group of guys from Hell's Kitchen were drinking over at O'Leary's last night, making noise, talking about coming uptown to teach a lesson. White boys, hard cases." "Hell's Kitchen," Bumpy repeated. "The Irish mob. Or maybe just freelancers." It didn't matter. They had crossed a line that God himself wouldn't have dared to cross. "We'll investigate, Bumpy," the captain said. "We'll round up the usuals. We'll get justice." Bumpy stood up. He wiped the blood from his hands onto a handkerchief. He looked at the captain with eyes that were black holes, void of any light or humanity. "No," Bumpy said softly. "You won't investigate. You will write this up as a robbery gone wrong. You will send the body to the funeral home, and then you will forget you ever saw this." "Bumpy, you can't just—" "If I see a uniform asking questions," Bumpy interrupted, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper, "if I see a detective knocking on doors, I will burn the 28th precinct to the ground with you inside it. Do you understand me?" The captain nodded slowly. He understood. This wasn't police business anymore. This was war. "Zip," Bumpy said, turning to his lieutenant. "Get the car." "Where are we going, Bumpy?" Zip asked, wiping his eyes. Bumpy looked at the river. He looked at the dark water churning against the pilings. "We're going hunting." The sun rose over Harlem, but it brought no warmth. The news of Elias's death spread through the neighborhood like a virus. The barbershops, the beauty salons, the stoops, everyone was whispering. They knew Elias. They knew he was a good boy. And they knew who his uncle was. The air in Harlem grew heavy with tension, a static charge waiting for the lightning strike. Bumpy didn't go home. He couldn't face Mamie yet. He couldn't look her in the eye and tell her that the boy she loved like a son was dead because of his name. He had to balance the scales first. He had to bring her a blood offering. He went to the Blue Lounge. He sat in the back room, the shades drawn, a bottle of whiskey on the table. He didn't drink. He just sat there, turning Elias's class ring over and over in his fingers. He had taken it off the body at the morgue. It was gold with a blue stone. Zip entered the room. He had been out on the streets for 3 hours, shaking trees, breaking branches. He looked tired, but grimly satisfied. "I got a name," Zip said, closing the door. Bumpy stopped spinning the ring. "Tell me." "It's a crew called the Mott Haven Boys," Zip said. 4 of them, led by a guy named Unstable Mick. They're usually Bronx-based, but they've been doing work for the Italians, trying to impress the Genovese family. They thought if they took out someone close to you, it would show they had guts, show they were ready for the big time. "Guts," Bumpy whispered. "They grab a college kid and hang him from a bridge, and they call it guts." "They're holed up in a warehouse over in the Navy Yard," Zip continued, "an old textile storage place. My contact says they're still there, celebrating, drinking, thinking they're kings of the city." Bumpy stood up. He put the ring in his pocket. He buttoned his coat. "How many men do we need?" Zip asked. "I can get 20 guys. We can storm the place, shoot it up." "No," Bumpy said. "No guns." Zip frowned. "Bumpy, they're armed. They're killers." "I said no guns," Bumpy repeated. He walked over to the wall where a set of heavy iron fireplace pokers hung. He didn't take them. He walked past them to the closet. He opened it and pulled out a length of heavy industrial steel chain. It was the kind of chain used to secure cargo on trucks. It was cold, greasy, and heavy. "Get the van," Bumpy said. "The delivery van. No windows." "You want to take them for a ride?" Zip asked, a dark smile touching his lips. "I want to take them to hell," Bumpy said. "But first, I want to look them in the eye." They left the club. Bumpy, Zip, and 2 of their biggest enforcers, Tiny, a man the size of a vending machine, and Cato, who was quick with a knife. They piled into the back of a nondescript laundry van. The drive to the Navy Yard took 40 minutes. Bumpy spent the time sitting on a spare tire, staring at the floor. He was thinking about Elias. He was thinking about the time he took the boy to his first Yankees game. Elias had caught a foul ball. He had been so happy. "I failed you," Bumpy thought. "I let the wolves in." The van stopped. The driver tapped on the partition. "We're here. Side entrance. Light security." Bumpy kicked the back doors open. The warehouse was a towering brick structure, grim and imposing against the gray sky. They moved quickly, sticking to the shadows. Zip picked the lock on the side door in 10 seconds. They slipped inside. The warehouse smelled of dust and old cotton. It was a maze of crates and pallets. In the center of the floor, under a single hanging bulb, sat a table. 4 men were sitting around it, playing cards, a bottle of whiskey passing between them. Their laughter echoed in the vast, empty space. It was the laughter of men who had no conscience. Bumpy motioned for Tiny and Cato to flank them. He waited. He wanted to hear them. "Did you see his face?" One of the men laughed. He was big, red-faced, wearing a dirty undershirt. This was Mick, begging like a little girl. "Please, my uncle, please." "Uncle Bumpy ain't gonna do nothing," another man sneered. "He's washed up, an old man in a suit. We sent a message. Now we take the territory." "King of the apes," Mick chuckled, slapping a card down. "That was a nice touch, Donnie." Bumpy stepped out of the shadows. He didn't run. He walked. His footsteps on the concrete floor were heavy, deliberate. Clack, clack, clack. The laughter stopped. The four men turned. They saw a figure in a long black coat, a fedora shading his eyes, walking toward them with the inevitability of a funeral procession. "Who the hell are you?" Mick shouted, reaching for a pistol on the table. "I'm the uncle," Bumpy said. Zip, Tiny, and Cato surged forward from the darkness. It wasn't a fight. It was an avalanche. Tiny slammed into Donnie, the one who had written the sign, driving him into a stack of crates with a bone-shattering crunch. Cato kicked the chair out from under another man, spinning him to the ground and putting a boot on his throat. Mick managed to grab his gun, but before he could raise it, Bumpy was there. Bumpy moved with a speed that defied his age. He grabbed Mick's wrist, twisting it violently until the bones snapped with a wet pop. The gun clattered to the floor. Mick screamed, falling to his knees. Bumpy didn't stop. He grabbed a handful of Mick's hair and slammed his face into the card table. Cards and whiskey bottles flew everywhere. Bumpy pulled Mick's head back. Blood was streaming from Mick's nose, but he was conscious. "Look at me," Bumpy commanded. Mick looked. He saw death. "You like hanging boys?" Bumpy asked softly. "You like ropes?" "Screw you," Mick spat, blood spraying onto Bumpy's coat. "You're dead, Johnson. The Genovese family will—" Bumpy slammed his face into the table again, harder this time. Teeth cracked. "This isn't business," Bumpy said. "This is family, and you don't know the Genovese. They don't back failures, and they don't back child killers." Zip dragged the other two men into the center. All four were battered, bleeding, but alive. Tiny held them down with ease. "What do we do with them, Bumpy?" Zip asked, breathing hard. "The river is right there." "Concrete shoes?" Bumpy looked at the four men. They were terrified now. The bravado was gone. They realized that they were in a room with a monster, and there were no police coming to save them. "Too easy," Bumpy said. "The river is quiet, peaceful. Elias didn't get peace. He got terror. He got pain." Bumpy walked over to the corner where he had dropped the heavy canvas bag he brought from the club. He unzipped it. The sound of the heavy steel chains clanking together made the men flinch. "Get them up," Bumpy said. "Load them in the van." "Where are we going?" Donnie whimpered, holding his broken ribs. Bumpy turned to him. He smiled. It was a smile that would haunt Zip's nightmares for years. "You boys like to travel?" Bumpy asked. "I heard you're from out of town. I think it's time you went on a trip." They dragged the men out to the van. They bound their hands with zip ties and threw them into the back like sacks of garbage. Tiny sat in the back with a baseball bat, daring any of them to move. Bumpy sat in the passenger seat. "Head for the rail yards," Bumpy told the driver. "The freight terminal on 12th Avenue. The drive was quiet. The four men in the back were sobbing now, whispering prayers, bargaining with God. But God wasn't listening. Bumpy Johnson was the only authority that mattered tonight. When they arrived at the rail yard, it was nearly midnight. The fog had thickened, wrapping the rows of steel tracks in a ghostly shroud. The yard was a labyrinth of hulking shapes, boxcars, tankers, flatbeds. The ground rumbled with the idling of massive diesel engines. The air smelled of ozone and burning oil. It was an industrial wasteland, a place where things were crushed and moved and forgotten. Bumpy ordered the van to stop near the main switching line. He got out. He stood on the gravel, listening. He heard the deep, rhythmic thrum, thrum, thrum of a massive locomotive idling on the outbound track. It was a long-haul freighter, a beast of steel and iron destined for Chicago, pulling 100 cars of coal and steel. "Bring them out," Bumpy said. Zip and Tiny dragged the 4 men out of the van. The men stumbled on the loose gravel. When they saw the trains, confusion washed over their terrified faces. They expected a secluded spot with a shallow grave. They didn't expect a train yard. "What is this?" Mick stammered, his broken wrist cradled against his chest. "You gonna run us over? Is that it? Tie us to the tracks like a cartoon?" Bumpy walked over to him. He grabbed Mick by the collar and dragged him toward the front of the massive locomotive. The headlight was off, the engine resting, but the heat radiating from it was intense. "Run you over?" Bumpy said, shaking his head. "No, that's too quick. 1 second and it's lights out. You don't learn anything from that." Bumpy pointed to the front of the train. There was a heavy steel grate, the cow catcher, designed to sweep obstacles off the tracks. Above it were heavy iron handrails and coupling hooks. "Zip," Bumpy said. "Get the chains." Zip brought the heavy chains. Bumpy took one end. He looped it around Mick's waist, then threaded it through the iron grate of the cow catcher. He pulled it tight. Mick screamed as the steel bit into his ribs. Bumpy padlocked the chain. He moved to Donnie. He chained him next to Mick, then the other 2. He chained all 4 men to the front of the train. They were strapped to the engine like grotesque ornaments, their backs against the hot metal, their faces turned toward the empty track ahead. "You're crazy!" Donnie screamed, thrashing against the chains. "You can't do this! When this thing starts, the wind, the cold." "The speed," Bumpy corrected him. "Don't forget the speed. This is the Midnight Express. It doesn't stop until Chicago. That's 800 miles, 14 hours. The men began to wail. The realization hit them. They weren't going to be crushed instantly. They were going to be battered. They were going to be frozen by the wind chill. They were going to be terrified out of their minds as the ground rushed beneath their feet at 60 miles an hour. Bumpy stepped back. He stood on the gravel, just out of reach. He lit a cigar, the flare of the match illuminating his hard, unyielding face. "You hung my boy in the air," Bumpy said, his voice carrying over the idle of the engine. "You let him swing in the wind. You wanted to send a message? Well, you're the message now." "Please," Mick begged, tears streaming down his bloodied face. "We're sorry. We'll leave town. We'll do anything. Just don't let it move. Please, Bumpy. I got kids." Bumpy's eyes narrowed. Elias was a kid. He had a mother. He had a future. You took it. A whistle blew in the distance. The conductor was signaling the departure. The ground beneath them shook as the brakes hissed and released. Clang, clang. The coupling gears engaged. "Oh God, oh God, oh God!" One of the men started hyperventilating. Bumpy turned to walk away. "Wait," Mick screamed. "How do we get off? When does it stop?" Bumpy stopped. He looked back over his shoulder. "It stops when the engineer decides to stop," Bumpy said. "If you're lucky, he'll see you in Chicago. If you're not, well, it's a long ride." The train lurched forward. It was slow at first, a grinding metallic groan. The 4 men screamed in unison, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. They scrambled for footing on the narrow metal ledge of the cowcatcher, their chains pulling taut. Bumpy watched. He watched as the train gathered speed. 5 miles an hour. 10. The men were screaming at him, cursing him, begging him. Bumpy didn't blink. He watched the massive steel wheels turn, grinding the steel tracks. He watched the black smoke pour from the stack. 20 miles an hour. The wind began to whip their clothes. Their voices were being swallowed by the roar of the engine. The train passed Bumpy. He felt the rush of air, the power of the machine. He saw the faces of the 4 men one last time, contorted masks of horror, their mouths open in silent screams as they realized their fate was sealed. They were chained to a dragon, and the dragon was waking up. Bumpy watched the red taillights of the caboose fade into the fog, the rhythmic clack, clack, clack of the wheels fading into the distance. The screams were gone. All that was left was the silence of the yard and the smell of diesel. Zip stepped up beside him. Zip looked a little pale. Even for him, this was medieval. "Do you think they'll make it to Chicago?" Zip asked quietly. Bumpy took a drag of his cigar and exhaled a cloud of blue smoke into the cold air. "I don't know," Bumpy said, "but for the next 14 hours, they're going to have a lot of time to think about Elias." He turned and walked back toward the van. "Let's go. I have to go see Mamie. I have to tell her we handled it." "She gonna be okay?" Zip asked. "No," Bumpy said. "She'll never be okay. But at least she'll know that the men who did it paid the price." As they drove back to Harlem, Bumpy felt the knot in his chest loosen slightly. It wasn't gone. The grief would be there forever. But the rage had been fed. He had balanced the scales. He had sent a message to every crew, every racist, every punk with a rope in the 5 boroughs. If you touch Bumpy Johnson's blood, you don't just die, you suffer. But the war wasn't over. Bumpy knew that violence begat violence. The Mott Haven boys were just soldiers. Someone had pointed them toward Elias. Someone had sanctioned the hit. And Bumpy wouldn't rest until he found the head of the snake. He arrived home as the sun was fully up. The house was quiet. He unlocked the door and walked in. Mamie was sitting in the kitchen, a cup of cold tea in front of her. Her eyes were red and swollen. She looked up when he entered. She saw the blood on his coat. Not his blood, but the blood of the men he had broken. She didn't ask where he had been. She knew. She stood up and walked over to him. She placed her hands on his chest. "Is it done?" she whispered. Bumpy looked into her eyes. He saw the pain, but he also saw the steel. She was a Johnson. She understood the cost of their life. "It's done," Bumpy said. "They caught a train, Mamie. They won't be coming back." Mamie nodded. She leaned her head against his chest and began to weep, soft, shaking sobs of grief for the boy who would never come home. Bumpy held her. He stared out the window at the street, his eyes hard and cold. He had chained the monsters to the train, but he knew, deep down, that the train was just the beginning. The tracks went on forever, and there were always more monsters waiting at the next station. But for tonight, the debt was paid. With iron. The freight train, known as the Midnight Express, rattled into the Chicago rail yard just as the first gray streaks of dawn were bleeding into the sky. It was a cold morning, the kind that froze breath in the throat and turned steel brittle. The train was 3 hours late, slowed by the heavy load and the biting wind that whipped across the plains. The engineer, a tired man named Miller with soot in the creases of his face, pulled the brake lever, the massive iron wheels screeching in protest as the beast ground to a halt. Miller climbed down from the cab, his boots crunching on the frosted gravel. He was looking forward to hot coffee and a warm bed. He walked toward the front of the engine to check the coupling on the cowcatcher, a routine inspection he had done 1,000 times. But as he rounded the massive steel nose of the locomotive, he stopped. His coffee thermos slipped from his gloved hand and shattered on the ground. Steam hissed from the relief valves, curling around the front of the train like a shroud. Through the mist, Miller saw them. They were no longer men. They were frozen monuments to agony. 4 figures, lashed to the steel grate with heavy industrial chains, their bodies contorted, their clothes shredded by the wind and the debris of 800 miles of track. Their faces were masks of ice, mouths frozen open in silent, eternal screams. The wind at 60 miles an hour, combined with the freezing temperatures, had turned them into statues. Miller backed away, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He turned and ran toward the station house, screaming for the police. By noon, the news had reached New York City. The papers didn't have the pictures. They were too gruesome even for the tabloids. But they had the headlines. The Midnight Express murders. Gang war reaches Chicago. 4 men found chained to train. In Harlem, the streets were quiet. There was no celebration. This wasn't a victory. It was a statement. It was a message written in bold, bloody letters that everyone from the corner boys to the church deacons understood. Bumpy Johnson was not just a gangster. He was a force of nature. And if you touched his family, there was no place on earth far enough to hide. Bumpy sat in his kitchen, the newspaper spread out on the table before him. He read the article slowly, his face impassive. Mamie stood at the stove, making grits. She didn't look at the paper. She didn't need to. She knew what was in it. She knew the cost of the peace she enjoyed in her home. They found them, Bumpy said quietly. Mamie turned. She wiped her hands on her apron. Did they say who they were? Just names, Bumpy said. Mick, Donnie, just soldiers. Soldiers follow orders, Mamie said. Her voice was hard, harder than he had ever heard it. She walked over to the table and looked down at him. Elias wasn't killed by soldiers, Ellsworth. He was killed by a general who thought we were weak. Bumpy looked up at his wife. He saw the grief in her eyes, the raw, gaping wound left by her nephew's death. But he also saw a demand for closure, total closure. I know, Bumpy said. The Mott Haven boys were working for someone. Zip is digging. Dig deep, Mamie said, because until the head is cut off, the snake is still in the grass. The phone rang. It was Zip. Bumpy, Zip's voice was tight. We got heat. The Italians are going crazy. Not because the guys are dead, but because of how you did it. It's all over the news. The Genovese family feels disrespected. They say you made a spectacle. I made an example, Bumpy corrected. What else? I found out who gave the order, Zip said. It wasn't the commission. The old Dons, they don't like this racial stuff. It's bad for business. It brings the feds. This was a rogue move. Who? Bumpy asked. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Vinnie Moretti, Zip said. Vinnie the Hammer. He's a capo in East Harlem. He's been trying to push into the numbers racket on 116th Street. He hates you, Bumpy. He calls you, well, you know what he calls you. He hired the Irish kids to kill Elias, hoping you'd go wild and get yourself killed by the cops. He wanted to provoke a war. Vinnie Moretti. Bumpy repeated the name. He knew him. a fat, loudmouth sadist who enjoyed hurting people, a man who had no honor, only ambition. "Where is he?" "He's holed up in his social club on Pleasant Avenue," Zip said. "He's got 20 guys around him. He knows you're coming." "Let him wait," Bumpy said. "Today is Elias's funeral. We bury the boy first. Then we bury the butcher." The funeral for Elias Johnson was held at the Abyssinian Baptist Church. It was a somber affair, attended by hundreds. The community came out not just to mourn, but to show solidarity. They filled the pews, the aisles, and the steps outside. Elias lay in an open casket, a high collar covering the rope burns on his neck, his face reconstructed by the mortician to look like he was sleeping. Bumpy sat in the front row, Mamie beside him. He wore a black suit, black tie, and sunglasses. He didn't cry. He watched the doors. He watched the windows. He watched the hands of every man who walked into the church. Even in the house of God, Bumpy Johnson was a general on the battlefield. The choir was singing, "Precious Lord, Take My Hand," when the sound of screeching tires cut through the hymn. Outside, a dark sedan roared past the church. A Thompson submachine gun chattered, the sound like a jackhammer. Bullets chewed up the sandstone steps of the church. Glass shattered as the stained glass window of the Archangel Michael exploded inward in a shower of colored shards. Screams erupted. People dove under the pews. Bumpy moved instantly. He didn't duck. He threw his body over Mamie, shielding her with his own bulk as wood chips and glass rained down on them. The car sped away, tires squealing around the corner. Silence returned to the church, broken only by the sobbing of terrifying parishioners. Bumpy slowly lifted his head. He checked Mamie. She was shaking, covered in glass dust, but unharmed. He stood up. He walked to the center aisle. He looked at the casket. A single stray bullet had grazed the wood, leaving a jagged, splintered gouge in the mahogany. They had shot at a funeral. They had shot at the church. They had shot at Elias's body. Bumpy turned to face the congregation. His sunglasses were gone. His eyes were burning with a fire that could consume the world. "Everyone go home," Bumpy said. His voice was calm, but it carried to the back of the balcony. "Go home and lock your doors. The service is over." He walked out of the church. Zip was waiting by the car, holding a shotgun. Zip's face was pale with rage. "They shot up the church, Bumpy," Zip said. "Vinnie Moretti. It had to be him." "He missed," Bumpy said. He opened the trunk of the Cadillac. He pulled out a leather bag. It clinked with the sound of heavy metal. "He missed me. He missed Mamie. But he hit the casket." Bumpy closed the trunk. "Get the boys," Bumpy said. "All of them. We're not going to Pleasant Avenue. We're going to send a message to the commission. I want a meeting. Tonight." "With who?" Zip asked. "The 5 families won't sit with you right now. They think you're radioactive." "Call Frank Costello," Bumpy said. "Tell him I'm not asking for permission. Tell him I'm giving him a choice. Either he gives me Moretti, or I turn New York City into a graveyard. Tell him I'll start hitting their trucks, their casinos, their families. Tell him the Midnight Express is just a commuter train compared to what I'll do next." Zip nodded. He ran to a payphone. Bumpy stood on the steps of the church, looking at the bullet holes in the stone. He touched one with his finger. It was still warm. "You made a mistake, Vinnie," Bumpy whispered. "You should have killed me." The meeting took place in neutral territory, a warehouse in the meatpacking district owned by the Teamsters. It was midnight, exactly 24 hours after the train had left the station. Frank Costello, the Prime Minister of the underworld, sat at a folding table. He was a man of reason, a man who preferred bribes to bullets. He looked at Bumpy Johnson, who stood on the other side of the table, flanked by Zip and Tiny. Bumpy wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing a leather coat and work boots. He looked like a man ready to pour concrete. "You're making a lot of noise, Bumpy," Costello said, his voice raspy. "Chaining men to trains, headlines, now shootouts at churches. This is bad for business. The mayor is breathing down my neck." "Your boy Moretti shot at my wife," Bumpy said. "He shot at a funeral. He killed a civilian kid to get a rise out of me." "Moretti is a loose cannon," Costello admitted. "But he's a made man. You know the rules. You can't touch a made man without permission. If you kill a capo, we have to go to war. It's the law." "The law?" Bumpy laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Where was the law when my cousin was hanging from a bridge? Where was the law when my mother's house burned? Don't talk to me about rules, Frank. Moretti broke the rules. He made it personal." Bumpy leaned forward, placing his hands on the table. "I'm going to kill him," Bumpy said. "I'm telling you this out of respect. I'm going to kill him, and I'm going to kill anyone who stands next to him. If you protect him, I kill you. If the Genovese protect him, I burn their clubs. I have nothing to lose, Frank. My blood is already spilled. You want to save your empire? Step aside." Costello looked at Bumpy. He saw the resolve. He knew Bumpy wasn't bluffing. Bumpy Johnson controlled Harlem. If he went to war, the heroin trade would stop. The numbers racket would stop. The city would bleed money. And Vinnie Moretti wasn't worth the loss in profits. Moretti was a thug, a liability who brought unnecessary heat. Costello lit a cigarette. He took a long drag. "Vinnie is at a construction site tonight," Costello said softly. "The new high-rise on 34th Street. He's supervising a concrete pour. He likes to watch the cement set. Says it relaxes him." Bumpy didn't smile. He just nodded. "His guards?" Bumpy asked. "They might get thirsty around 2 a.m., Costello said. "They might take a break." "Thank you, Frank," Bumpy said. "Bumpy," Costello said as Bumpy turned to leave. "Make it clean. No more trains, no more headlines. Make him disappear." "He won't disappear," Bumpy said. "He'll just become part of the foundation." Bumpy and his crew arrived at the construction site at 2:15 a.m. The skeleton of the skyscraper rose into the night sky, a grid of steel beams and shadows. The site was lit by work lights that cast long, eerie shadows across the mud and machinery. There were 2 guards at the gate. They were gone. Costello had kept his word. Bumpy signaled Zip and Tiny to stay back. "He's mine," Bumpy said. Bumpy walked into the site alone. He carried a heavy iron pipe in his hand. He moved through the maze of rebar and wooden forms. In the center of the site, a large cement mixer was churning, its rhythmic whoosh, whoosh, masking the sound of Bumpy's footsteps. Standing near the edge of a deep foundation pit was Vinnie Moretti. He was wearing a hard hat and an expensive camel hair coat. He was smoking a cigar, looking down into the wet concrete, lost in thought. He was probably thinking about how he was going to take over Harlem once Bumpy was dead. Bumpy stopped 10 feet behind him. "Vinnie," Bumpy said. Moretti spun around. He reached for the gun in his shoulder holster, but he was slow. He was fat and slow and arrogant. Bumpy swung the iron pipe. It connected with Moretti's forearm with a sickening crack. The gun flew into the wet cement. Moretti howled, clutching his broken arm. "Johnson!" Moretti screamed, stumbling back. "You're dead! You hear me? You can't touch me! I'm a capo!" Bumpy stepped closer. "You're not a capo tonight, Vinnie. Tonight, you're just the guy who shot at my wife." Moretti scrambled backward, his heels catching on the edge of the wooden form. He fell into the mud. He looked up at Bumpy, his eyes wide with terror. He saw the same look that the Mott Haven boys had seen before the train started moving. Wait, Moretti pleaded. We can work this out. I'll give you the numbers. I'll give you the territory. I'll pay you. You can't pay for Elias, Bumpy said. You can't pay for the fear in my wife's eyes. Bumpy dropped the pipe. He didn't need it. He grabbed Moretti by the lapels of his expensive coat. Moretti tried to fight, clawing at Bumpy's face, but he was powerless against the strength of a man fueled by pure vengeance. Bumpy dragged him to the edge of the pit. Below them, 10 feet down, was a fresh pour of concrete. It was deep, wet, and heavy. You like construction, Vinny? Bumpy asked. You like building things? Well, you're going to help build this city. No, please, Bumpy, Moretti screamed. Frank won't let you get away with this. Frank gave me the address, Bumpy whispered. The hope died in Moretti's eyes. He realized he had been sold out. He was alone. Bumpy shoved him. Moretti fell. He landed in the center of the wet concrete with a heavy, wet splat. He sank immediately to his waist. The slurry was thick, quicksand-like. He struggled, thrashing his arms, but the more he moved, the deeper he sank. Help! Moretti screamed, his voice echoing off the steel beams. Pull me out! Bumpy stood on the edge, looking down. He picked up a shovel that was leaning against a pile of sand. You sent boys to kill a student, Bumpy said. You hung him from a bridge. You thought you were untouchable. I'm sorry, Moretti wept, the concrete now up to his chest. The pressure was crushing his lungs. I'm sorry. Apology accepted, Bumpy said. He threw the shovel into the pit. It landed next to Moretti. Bumpy turned to the control panel of the cement chute above the pit. He pulled the lever. A fresh avalanche of wet gray concrete poured down from the hopper above. It cascaded over Vinnie Moretti, burying his screams, burying his ambition, burying the hate. Bumpy watched until the pit was level. He watched until the surface was smooth and gray. There was no sign of Vinnie Moretti, just a fresh foundation for a new building. Rest in peace, Vinnie, Bumpy said. You're finally supporting the community. He turned and walked away. The only sound was the churning of the mixer and the distant siren of a police car that would never find the body. The next morning, Harlem was quiet. The tension that had gripped the neighborhood for 3 days had broken. The word was out. Vinnie Moretti had vanished. The Italians had gone silent. The Mott Haven boys were gone. Bumpy Johnson had cleaned house. He sat on the front stoop of his brownstone, watching the sun come up. He was tired. His bones ached. He felt every year of his life weighing on his shoulders. The violence had a cost. It took pieces of your soul that you never got back. The door opened behind him. Mamie walked out. She was holding 2 cups of coffee. She sat down beside him on the cold stone step. She handed him a cup. He took it, his scarred hands wrapping around the warmth. Is it over? Mamie asked. She didn't look at him. She looked at the street, where children were starting to walk to school. For now, Bumpy said. Moretti is gone. Costello won't move against us. We have peace. And Elias? Mamie asked softly. Bumpy reached into his pocket. He pulled out the gold class ring with the blue stone. He handed it to her. He's at rest, Mamie. The men who hurt him, they've been judged. Mamie took the ring. She held it to her chest. A single tear rolled down her cheek, but she nodded. She leaned her head on Bumpy's shoulder. You're a hard man, Ellsworth Johnson, she whispered. I have to be, Bumpy said, putting his arm around her, because the world is hard, and I promised I'd keep you safe. You did, she said. but promises are heavy. I can carry them, Bumpy said. They sat there in silence as the city woke up around them. The king and queen of Harlem. They had won the war, but the scars would remain. Bumpy looked at his hands. He thought of the train. He thought of the concrete. He knew he was a monster to the world. But as he looked at Mamie, safe and alive beside him, he knew he could live with being a monster, as long as he was her monster. A car drove by slowly. The driver, an old man from the neighborhood, honked his horn and waved respectfully. "Morning, Mr. Johnson. Morning, Mrs. Johnson." Bumpy nodded. He took a sip of his coffee. "Morning," Bumpy said. The sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the fog. The trains were running on time. The concrete was setting on 34th Street. And Bumpy Johnson was still the king. Thanks for listening, folks. If you liked that video and want more, be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss any Bumpy Johnson stories.